Mark and Julia Winters seemed like the perfect suburban couple, quiet, professional, and deeply private, until a flirtation with wife-swapping led them into the lives of Trevor and Dana Collins, unlocking a hidden obsession that would spiral into betrayal, manipulation, and a calculated murder that no one saw coming. In the peaceful suburb of Glenridge, where the lawns were always trimmed and neighbors greeted each other with polite smiles, two couples led lives that, on the surface, appeared ideal. Mark and Julia Winters had been married for 9 years. Both were professionals, Mark an accountant, Julia a marketing consultant, living in a modern 2-story home with sleek furniture and framed vacation photos that gave no hint of any underlying tension. They were quiet, structured, and disciplined, the kind of couple others assumed had it all together. But behind closed doors, their marriage had grown stale. The routines were predictable. The spark that once existed had dulled, and although they rarely fought, there was a coldness that neither wanted to acknowledge out loud. A few houses down the cul-de-sac, Trevor and Dana Collins lived a very different life. They were more spontaneous, more open, and certainly more uninhibited. Trevor owned a small landscape design company and worked from home. Dana taught yoga part-time and often hosted wellness nights, game nights, and casual barbecues that made their home a social hub. Where the Winters kept to themselves, the Collins were always surrounded by people. It was at one of those backyard parties that everything began to change. Mark and Julia had accepted the invitation somewhat reluctantly. They weren't the type to mingle much, but they'd been trying to do more as a couple. That night, after a few drinks and easy conversation, the topic of open relationships came up, lightly at first as a joke. But Trevor and Dana didn't laugh. Instead, they shared that they had experimented with consensual non-monogamy. They spoke with confidence and calm, as if it were no more strange than trying a new restaurant. Julia seemed stunned. Mark, however, was intrigued. What started as a late-night conversation planted a seed that grew in the weeks that followed. Mark brought it up to Julia again and again. At first, she dismissed it, assuming he was joking, but he persisted, framing it as an opportunity to rediscover excitement and rebuild intimacy. Julia, hesitant but emotionally distant herself, finally gave in, on the condition that everything would be honest, equal, and controlled. The first time was awkward. Arranged over dinner and drinks, it felt more like a business transaction than a passionate decision. But everyone agreed it was surprisingly drama-free. Boundaries were drawn. It would be occasional, always with full transparency, and never about emotion. Over the next few months, what had been one isolated night turned into something more regular. The couples began to meet once a month, alternating houses, keeping their arrangement hidden from everyone else in the neighborhood. Despite the rules, subtle changes were already taking root. Mark became more animated after their encounters, more focused on his appearance, more distracted in Julia's presence. Dana, warm and charming, had made an impression far stronger than Mark had anticipated. What none of them realized at the time was that the line between control and chaos had already been crossed. This wasn't just a shared secret anymore. It was the beginning of something no one could undo. As the months passed, what had started as a carefully controlled arrangement began to unravel in ways none of them had predicted. Mark's fascination with Dana deepened, shifting from casual interest to something far more intense. While the others returned to their regular lives between meetings, Mark carried Dana with him everywhere, in his thoughts, in his dreams, in the way he began to interpret the world. He told himself it was just excitement, something new to fill the dull space that had formed in his marriage, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He started texting Dana outside of their planned meetups. At first, the messages were light memes, jokes, small talk. Dana responded politely, sometimes even warmly, assuming it was harmless. But as the messages became more frequent and more personal, she grew uneasy. Mark would ask where she was, what she was wearing, if she ever thought about him when they weren't together. He began referencing things she hadn't told him, things he could only have known by watching or listening. It was subtle but unmistakable. Dana stopped responding as often, but the silence only seemed to fuel him more. Trevor noticed first. He saw how Dana's mood shifted after checking her phone. He sensed the tension growing whenever Mark was near. Dana confessed that Mark had been texting her too much, saying strange things. Trevor confronted her gently, trying not to sound angry. She reassured him it would stop, that she would handle it, but Trevor's patience was wearing thin. The arrangement had been built on trust and balance, and Mark was clearly breaking both. Meanwhile, Julia remained unaware of the undercurrent threatening to destroy everything. Mark still maintained the image of a dedicated husband, though he had grown distant. He stayed up late on his computer, claiming to catch up on work. He took long walks alone with his phone in hand. Julia chalked it up to stress. She had no reason to suspect that her husband was becoming obsessed with another woman, someone she considered a friend. Then came the weekend getaway. Trevor had suggested it as a way to reset, to return to the original spirit of the arrangement, and maybe smooth things over. The four of them rented a remote cabin near a lake, surrounded by trees and silence. On the surface, it seemed like a peaceful break, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Mark hovered around Dana, watching her too closely, laughing too loudly at her jokes. Trevor stayed tight-lipped, constantly alert. Julia, for the first time, sensed something strange but couldn't quite name it. Dana took Mark aside during a walk and told him it had to stop, that she was uncomfortable, that this wasn't what they had agreed to. She said she wanted to end the arrangement altogether. Mark smiled, nodded, and told her he understood, but inside something broke. He felt rejected, betrayed. In his mind, Dana wasn't just another person. She was his. And if she was pulling away, it had to be because of Trevor. Mark left that cabin with a decision already forming in his mind. The fantasy had shifted into something darker. This was no longer about excitement or pleasure. For Mark, it was about possession. And soon, it would be about revenge. After the cabin trip, Mark's obsession with Dana took a dangerous turn. Her rejection didn't humble him or make him reflect. Instead, it fueled a deep resentment that simmered beneath his carefully managed exterior. In public, he maintained the role of the polite, mild-mannered neighbor, but in private, his thoughts had turned cold and methodical. He was convinced Dana loved him, convinced that Trevor was the only thing standing in their way. The more he dwelled on it, the more he saw Trevor not just as a rival, but as a barrier that had to be removed. Mark began isolating himself. He avoided Julia, barely speaking to her at home. He claimed to be overloaded with work, taking late-night conference calls that didn't exist and leaving the house at odd hours. He grew paranoid, installing extra locks on the garage and buying equipment he insisted was for a new project. Julia noticed, but every time she asked questions, he offered calm, calculated answers that gave her no clear reason to suspect anything more. Online, Mark immersed himself in dark corners of the internet. He studied toxins, watched true crime, breakdowns, and read obscure medical journals. He searched for substances that were odorless, tasteless, and capable of mimicking natural causes of death. After weeks of research, he settled on a rare, plant-based compound often used in undetectable poisonings. It could cause cardiac arrest within minutes, leaving almost no trace once metabolized. He ordered it through an encrypted site using cryptocurrency and a false identity. He knew the risks, but the thrill of control drowned out his fear. He practiced his plan meticulously. Mark timed how long it would take to enter and exit Trevor's house unnoticed. He knew the layout, the alarm code, the weak point in the back fence. One evening, when he knew Dana would be teaching a yoga class across town, he slipped into the Collins' backyard with gloves on and a small vial tucked inside a water bottle. Trevor, in his usual routine, was in the garage lifting weights. Mark knew he'd be thirsty. He waited, silent and still, then left the tampered bottle beside the weight bench and disappeared as easily as he had come. Later that night, Trevor was found by a neighbor who had heard a strange thud and gone to investigate. He was unconscious, pale, his body convulsing. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. The hospital ruled it a sudden cardiac event. Trevor had no history of heart problems, but stress and genetics were blamed. No autopsy beyond a basic toxicology screen was performed. Nothing suspicious showed up. The case was closed within days. Dana was shattered. Her grief was genuine and raw. She blamed herself for letting things become too complicated. Mark, on the other hand, was eerily calm. He offered support, brought over meals, even helped make funeral arrangements. Julia noticed the strange shift in him. How oddly at peace he seemed after months of restless nights. Something in her gut told her it wasn't right, but she had no proof. Mark believed he had succeeded. He thought he had cleared the way for a new life with Dana. But he had underestimated two things: the weight of his own arrogance and the trail of small invisible clues he had unknowingly left behind. Mark's confidence grew in the days following Trevor's death. The absence of suspicion fed his delusion that he had committed the perfect crime. He had executed every detail according to plan, left no fingerprints, no digital trail, and had used a compound so obscure it passed unnoticed in standard tests. But the flaw wasn't in his method. It was in his belief that people wouldn't start to notice the strange pieces he couldn't help but leave behind. His first mistake came just a week after the funeral. In an attempt to express what he thought was sympathy, Mark left a bouquet of flowers on Dana's porch in the early hours of the morning. To most, it would seem like a harmless gesture, but the flowers weren't ordinary. They were wild orchids, deep violet and white, rare and specific to a mountainous region near the lake where the four of them had stayed months earlier. Mark had picked them himself, convinced the gesture would be seen as thoughtful, even romantic. Dana noticed the flowers the moment she stepped outside. At first, she assumed someone had sent them from out of town, but when she inspected the wrapping, there was no card, no packaging, just the raw stems, fresh and untrimmed. The sight made her uneasy. She couldn't explain why, but something about it felt off. She mentioned them later to a close friend who worked in horticulture. Out of curiosity, the friend looked up the species and confirmed their rarity. They didn't grow in Glenridge. They couldn't even survive in the region's climate. At the same time, Julia's suspicions were growing. The emotional distance in her marriage had grown into something undeniable. Mark was no longer even pretending to be present. He had become eerily serene, methodical in a way that felt unnatural. He barely reacted to news anymore, didn't flinch at Dana's grief, and no longer touched her at all. One night, while organizing the garage, Julia found something wedged beneath a loose panel in the wall. It was an old phone, dusty and turned off, with no identifying case. When she charged it, what she saw made her heart sink. The phone contained hundreds of messages to Dana, sent over months. Most were unanswered. Some were disturbing, long, obsessive monologues about how they were meant to be together, how Trevor didn't deserve her, how everything would be different soon. It was the ramblings of a man unraveling, and Julia knew immediately this was more than an affair. She copied the messages, recorded the device's serial number, and went to the police. With the phone and the information about the orchids, authorities reopened Trevor's case. Investigators pulled Mark's internet history and, despite his attempts to hide it, found encrypted searches, access to dark web forums and instructions for purchasing chemical agents. They traced his purchases, recovered deleted files, and built a picture of a man who had not only planned a murder, but had documented every step of it. Mark's carefully controlled world began to collapse. He had underestimated the quiet instincts of the people around him. His arrogance had left a trail of flowers, of words and of data that, once pieced together, told a chilling truth. The perfect crime had never existed, only a perfect illusion. Mark was arrested on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, led away from his office in handcuffs as stunned co-workers watched through glass walls. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. He simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting it. At the police station, he was calm, even cooperative, until investigators began laying out the evidence. The phone Julia had turned in, the online searches, the encrypted chemical purchases, and the rare wild orchids, all small pieces that, when connected, formed a clear and damning picture. Mark's confidence wavered for the first time, though he initially denied any involvement in Trevor's death. The weight of the evidence pressed harder with each passing day. The messages on the hidden phone were the most incriminating. They revealed a steady descent into obsession, Dozens of messages expressing jealousy, anger, and longing, ending in disturbing promises that things would change soon. The timing of the most intense messages, just days before Trevor's death, left little room for interpretation. Forensic specialists confirmed the toxin used in Trevor's death could be traced back to compounds Mark had researched online. Though it had metabolized quickly, new testing methods identified trace elements in Trevor's blood that matched the substance found in Mark's garage. Prosecutors built a narrative that painted Mark not as a momentary aggressor, but a man who had meticulously planned a murder out of rejection and fantasy. The trial drew widespread media attention. Reporters called it the Glenridge love swap murder, sensationalizing every detail. The courtroom was filled with people who had once shared potlucks and block parties with the two couples. Now, they listened in silence as prosecutors described the cold precision of the crime. Mark sat expressionless through most of the proceedings, occasionally jotting notes, never once looking at Julia or Dana. Dana didn't attend the trial. After Mark's arrest, she sold the house she had shared with Trevor and left Glenridge quietly. Friends said she moved across the country to start over, cutting ties with nearly everyone from her old life. Julia filed for divorce before the trial had even begun. Her testimony was brief but powerful. She described the changes in Mark's behavior, the burner phone, and the eerie calm that had settled over him after Trevor's death. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. She wanted the court to know that she had no idea who her husband had become. After 3 weeks of testimony and just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Mark Winters was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read aloud, he showed no emotion. He looked ahead, silent, and nodded once, almost approvingly. The community of Glenridge never quite recovered. The story haunted its residents for years, a reminder of how ordinary lives can hide extraordinary darkness. What had started as a consensual arrangement between trusting adults had become a catalyst for obsession, manipulation, and murder. In the end, the pursuit of fantasy shattered 4 lives, leaving behind only grief, questions, and the chilling realization that some boundaries once crossed can never be redrawn.